Hey everyone, my name is Megan Ware. I'm the Education Outreach Assistant at the Antonio J. Waring Archaeology Lab, University of West Georgia. I'm also a student, like many of you. I study anthropology and archaeology at the university, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about archaeology and pottery. So I'd like to ask you to take a minute and think about what you think when I say pottery. I mean, do you think about an orange flower pot? If you did, then good. That's what a lot of pottery looks like. But there's a lot more shapes and colors that pottery can take. But before I teach you about what pottery is used for, you have to know what pottery is made of. Pottery has been a super important tool for almost every group of people across all of history. That's because metal pans, paper plates, plastic bowls, and glasses didn't exist yet. But it's still super important for people today. Think about how we tend to grow plants. And outside of huge farms, a lot of us grow plants in flower pots, right? So I know you're probably wondering, how did they cook food if they didn't have the metal pots? Well, pottery was used for cooking. They used pottery for almost everything that we use now. People could cook and serve and store food that they were making, but pottery was used for more than just food. They created decorations too. I'm sure you've had an art class where you've had to make something out of clay. Did some of you make a figurine? Well, people all over the world have done the exact same thing, and that's the type of pottery too. Because pottery is technically anything that's been made of clay, or that's been baked or fired, as we call it, and after it's been shaped. This means that it could be pots, pans, plates, cups. It could also be figurines or statues or beads or earrings, just about anything else you want. It just means that it was made out of a baked clay. But pottery is more than just something useful and practical. It can have meaning too. Symbolism uses pictures and shapes to convey meanings. A lot of pottery can have depictions of a specific group's or society's beliefs, myths, or legends. To the Greeks, Hercules was an important myth. In the Disney movie, with the pottery that's seen here, you can tell that he's a powerful figure of strength. But to us in America, Superman is just like that. There's lots of examples like this. So, take a look at some of these pictures. What comes to mind? You might recognize the Statue of Liberty, Maleficent's horns, a Pokeball from Pokemon, the Incredibles logo, the Batman logo, Cinderella's slipper, or even the Mockingjay from the Hunger Games. All of these symbols get us to think about what it's referencing. Symbols are pictures that stand in for something that isn't actually there. I mean, I didn't post the pictures of anybody here, but their logos remind us of who they are and what they stand for. They're like words that aren't actually spoken. Every word has a meaning and refers to something, right? If I say tree, you probably think of like a large oak tree with a nice green shrubbery around the top. Symbols do this too. But before deciding on the symbolism that someone might put on a piece of pottery, they have to decide how they're going to make it. They usually have to find the clay straight from the ground, and they have to clean it, which I know, it sounds weird to clean the clay, but they have to get all the large chunks out of it in order to make the clay workable. The next step would have to be making a complex paste. So in order to do that, we need something called temper. But temper isn't one specific material. It can be anything from sand or crusted shells or even plants. Some people even used cow poop and horse poop because it had grass in it. Weird, right? I know. But once you mix in the temper with the clay, then you just add a little bit of water, and then you have to mix everything together because you want it even throughout clay. So you have to knead it, like when bakers do when they're making bread. You have to roll it and push it and squish everything together. And then after that, you have to roll it out and coil the clay mixture on top of itself and then smooth the sides together. Like most people start with a pinch pot and work up from there. So if you've ever taken an art class where you've dealt with pottery, it works a lot like that. So you take some water on your fingers and just gently smooth the sides together to get the shape you want out of it. But as I'm sure you know, wet clay doesn't hold its shape very well. So that's when you need to fire the pottery. I mean, if you drop a piece of wet clay, it kind of just goes splat. But if you drop a fire pot, it shatters because it's not a flexible material anymore. So you need to fire the pottery in order to get all of the water out. So then it'll maintain its shape and you can actually use it. But today, it's a lot easier to find and make pottery. You can just go to the store and get the clay, the slips, the glazes, the pottery stands, just about anything you need to make something out of pottery. There are fancy pottery wheels that make it faster and easier to create a piece of pottery. There's also electric kilns. Now, these mean that the pottery gets fired at a hotter temperature and therefore gets fired more evenly. When prehistoric people and people up until now have been firing pottery, they put it in the fire. They put all the wet things in the middle of the fire and surround it with either they just leave it open or they cover it with dirt and other things to help it seal. But typically, the hotter the fire, the closer to the middle you are. But you can't put all of your pottery in the middle. So there's going to be a part that faces towards the fire and a part that faces away from the fire. And the part that faces towards the fire will be cooked at a much higher temperature than the pottery away from the fire. So it gets to be a little uneven. And in the archaeological record, we see that with sooting. So the ashy colored stuff that's after a fire, that can happen on pottery too. So that's kind of how we tell how the pottery was fired. But electric kilns, there's no actual fire. It's just electricity heating up the air inside the kiln. So it becomes more thoroughly and more evenly fired. So what happens when we actually find pottery during an excavation? Well, it can either be cleaned before it's taken to the lab, or it's cleaned once it reaches the lab. And it's really rare to find pottery in whole, just because of the way, like somebody might have just dropped a pot and left it. Just kind of like you would if you're throwing out a piece of broken silverware or plates. But once we find it, then we take it to the lab where it's then it goes through a process called accessioning. Now, accessioning has a lot of paperwork involved, but it essentially means when a group of artifacts officially becomes a collection. And it's only after that point that pottery can be studied. So we at the archaeology lab usually deal with pottery sherds. It's spelled S-H-E-R-D-S. And I know you're like, wait, but I thought it was spelled S-H-A-R-D-S. Sorry. And that's And that's a fair question to ask. A lot of it has to do with glass being called shards and pottery being called sherds because they're not the same material. But we usually find bags and bags of pot sherds, but we never actually reconstruct the pottery itself. And you never really find a whole pot by itself, fully intact in the field, just because of how the earth moves and how it compresses on the pottery once it's buried. But we can take modern pottery that we get at Goodwill and other places, to reconstruct the pottery, to learn how pieces curve and how the edges and the lips essentially define what it is that the piece of pottery was used for. It's a really good teaching tool. So when you see these pictures, what do you think we can learn from a broken pot that's been put back together? We can learn a lot about the shape and the size and the lip shape of pottery if we have a lot of the pieces. The wider the angle is on a piece of pottery, the more likely it is to be a large whole pot. And size also helps determine function. So if you have a small pot versus a bigger pot, then the two pots might be used for different things. And the more curved that the lip shape is, then if it's a small lip shape, then it's probably used for storage. But if it's a large lip shape, then it's probably used for cooking. I mean, when you put something into a Tupperware container and put the lid on, the lid's not as big as the rest of the container, right? But when your mom's cooking pasta, it's got a wide lip and it's a very open vessel because she needs to be able to reach in there and move the pasta around to let it cook, right? So friendship pots are what we at the lab call our modern pottery that I get to put back together. So how do we start with a friendship pot? Well, first we have to find pottery, and then we spray it with something called primer, which is a special type of paint that lets you guys paint on top of it. And then I get to smash it. And then after it smashes, then you guys get to paint the pot sherds normally. And then eventually, once I get all the pieces, I put it back together with glue. And then after it's done being reconstructed, it usually gets put on display somewhere, either in the lab or sometimes in a library, depending on the event it's for. So today, your task is to take a pot and draw a symbol on it that means something to you. It can be anything you want. Just have fun with it. And once you get back, you'll have a chance to swap it with your friends and compare the different designs. But swapping pottery around also means something in the archaeological record. When a pot that looks like it's from South Georgia makes its way into Tennessee or Mississippi or even South Carolina, it means that trade's happening between two groups. And when trade's happening, it means that two groups have separately decided to come together and exchange food or pottery or shells or decoration or even arrowheads. And it means that people can share ideas through this pottery. And remember the symbolism? You can see the symbolism from another type of pottery in your own culture, or you could share your pottery with a different culture. And it's a really huge, important reason in why we find the study of pottery so interesting in archaeology. So I wanted to take a moment and thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you're a little more excited about archaeology. But I really just hope you got something out of this. I mean, learning's the most important thing we can do, even when we're adults. So I hope you have fun painting your pottery, and I can't wait to see what you guys do with it.